Hello, today we are going to be looking at higher order functions. This is sort of the part 2 on delegates. If you haven't watched the part 1, I'll link to a couple of videos. I might make a new part 1, which I have not made yet, but there is a pre-existing video, so you think you can link, I think it's part 1, that has this sort of introduction to delegates. So in this part, I assume you have that basic understanding of delegates. You're able to read the syntax. You're not confused with the angle brackets and func int bool and those kinds of things. Today's video is about higher order functions. Higher order functions are when a method takes another method as an argument. Then that method, the one that takes the method as an argument, is called a higher order function. Higher order functions can take one or more methods as arguments and can also return a method as an argument. So it's a type, since delegates are a type, and delegates are first class citizens of the .NET framework, .NET ecosystem. They are just like any other type that you can pass into methods or return from a method. In order to set the problem stage for this example, and this is a real world example for me, as in I use this a lot in my applications, and so I'm hoping I can explain the need for this higher order function. In LINQ we have methods like single, first, single default, first default. Now just between single and first, the meaning or the purpose or when you might use these methods is very specific. For example, single says I expect exactly 1, and if it's either none or more than 1, I want an exception. First means there could be more than 1, but there's at least 1, and I want the first. I'm not interested in any of the others. So when you use single, and we'll talk about single here now, when you use single, you're really saying, you're showing your intent. You're saying, I know this, given the filter criteria, that I expect exactly 1. But if there's none, I want you to throw an exception. If there's more than 1, I want you to throw an exception. And these methods, single and first, certainly throw the exceptions at the right times or for the right reasons. The problem is that their exceptions have no meaning. I think in single's case, it's like an argument exception. And the exception message will frequently say something like sequence contains more than 1 element. Okay, what sequence? And what are these extra elements? And the exception itself, the type of exception, argument exception, has no real meaning in a real world application. So I'll try and sort of paint a picture. You're in a system, you use this single, let's say, in many places in your application. In each area of the application, each part of the application, there's contextual information. Let's say, for example, in one part of the application, I'm working with vehicles. In another part of the application, I'm working with coverages. In another part of the application, I'm working with drivers. So when I use the single method in each of these different parts of the application, there's contextual information in my call site. By call site, I mean the code that is calling single, that I would like to use in my exception message if an exception occurs. For example, I would like, instead of saying argument contains or sequence contains no elements or contains more than 1 element, if I'm working with vehicles, I would like to say something like more than 1 Mercedes found. Maybe I'm expecting that there will be exactly 1 Mercedes in this collection of vehicles I have, and so I'll apply the criteria, filter criteria, and if there's more than 1, first of all, I like to include that in the message saying I was looking for Mercedes and I found more than 1. 2, which ones are these? Like if it's more than 1, is it 2, is it 3, is it 4, and which are these vehicles? Can I have some information about these vehicles, please? That's the area that's sort of missing, or information that's missing in the standard single methods that throw an exception. The other aspect, and is sort of connected here, is I love exceptions. I love throwing exceptions. This might sound strange to some people. I program to what I call program to exceptions. I haven't talked about that on this channel yet. But there is a criteria for when you throw an exception, or there are some prerequisites when you throw an exception. One, you need to have a very specific exception for those kinds of problems. You can't just use some generalized argument exception and that's kind of used across the board in your entire application. So the exception type needs to be very specific to the problem at hand. 2, you have to provide all and any information about the problem and clearly explain the problem in the exception message itself. And 3, if there's any solution or a way to solve the problem, for example, let's say somebody picked a state and it's the wrong state. Now, how they came into your system, whether they came from a front end you made or they had their own application that called your application, is irrelevant. But let's say the state is invalid, then you should give them an indication saying these are the valid states. Of course, in the case of states in the US, there's 50 states. You might think that's a bit too much, but there are many situations where there are a finite set of options and you just say it's an invalid option, but what are the valid options? So in order to throw an exception, or in order to have the right to throw an exception in my systems, you have to provide these 3 pieces of information. Unfortunately, the single method and the first methods and various other methods in LINQ don't satisfy that requirement. So I would like a single method wherein I can decide from the call site what type of exception I want to throw. 2, I want the single method to give me information about the items that it found that overlap more than one item. If there's 3 of them, I want to know which 3. First of all, I want to know there's 3 of them and I want to know which of those 3 it is so I can do something with that information and include that in my exception message. And then 3, I have context information at the call site. Like I'm working in this area with vehicles and I know I'm filtering on Mercedes. Then I would like to include that information in my exception message saying, hey, I was expecting exactly one Mercedes, but I found more than one. And these are the ones I found. So that's the basic premise or the need for this talk today. And we're going to implement that through higher order functions. And specifically, the method is going to be an extension method. Now I have some criteria for extension methods as well. I'm not a big fan of extension methods, primarily one, because I think they're overused or abused. But there's a very strong prerequisite for me to consider something to be an extension method. Now, let me talk about the problems just briefly. Extension methods are difficult to find or know that they exist, meaning the discoverability is very, very low, because if I put a dot, I'm not going to see an extension method just because I put a dot. The class or the namespace has to be included in this file for me to see that extension method even exists, for me to pick one. By simply changing the namespace, you can have different implementations for the exact same extension method, and that this actually happened in one of my applications that I inherited. And oh boy, what a pain that was to find out, because who would expect that to occur? So the same named method had different implementations, and in one case it was working, the other case it was not, and there's a minor kind of bug in there that would occur sometimes, and it was just a hard problem to solve, and fine, because nobody was expecting there to be 2 implementations for it. Certainly those of us who inherited the system. Extension methods are very frequently misused because they're coupling other things. For example, you've got a date time and you want to extend it, and you couple it to some of your objects. Like, how does that make any sense? This is not really what an extension method was supposed to be. The guidelines for extension methods is very clear. If the class is not yours, don't extend it. If the class is yours, don't extend it. It's just that simple. Anyway, so my criteria for when I think an extension method is worth or valid is if the entire .NET community can use your extension method, make use of it as in it's useful to them, then it's an extension method. It's not specific to you, your company, your team, your application, right? You're extending a type, and anyone that uses that type should find value in your extension method. And if you can't justify that value, then don't make it an extension method. Make it a static method on some class and just call it passing in the thing as our first argument. All right, enough of that. So let's get started with the code part, and let's see how this goes. Okay, so I have Visual Studio open here, and I've got a list of movies that I have pre-assembled here. This is just a bunch of hard-coded movies. As you can see here, that's not so relevant. Let me also change one of these movies to, I'm just going to change the year to 2019 just so I can use that as an experiment. I know there's no other movies that are for the year 2019. All right, so in this specific context, or in this specific area of my system, I'm working with movies, and I would like to say something like dot single, and the criteria I want to give this is m such that m dot year equals 2019, right? And I know I've put only one there, and we can test it out. Make sure this actually works. So you can see here that there's one movie, and it's called Maze Runner. Okay, so it exists. Now if I were to give it a different date, let's say 2015, and run this again, you'll see that get this exception. It says an invalid operation exception. Really? Is that an invalid operation? I don't know, but nonetheless. And the exception message says sequence contains more than one matching element. But like, can you please show me how many there are? At least tell me how many there are, and then maybe even show me which ones there are, so I can tell by looking at the exception message that maybe there's a data problem, maybe there's a programming problem, something happened, without having to dig through and hopefully trying to reproduce the same problem in production, right? So now that's what we want to fix. So what I'm going to define here is another class. Since I'm producing as an extension method, I'm going to call this enumerable extensions. It's going to be a class. Now this is a generic method, just like the single method is generic. And just for those of you who are not very familiar with the single method here, let me show you the some reason my zoom's not working. Anyhow, I'll try and show you the. So it says this is a. Oh, that's weird. It's a func of movie bool. And if just to be we're clear on the same page, this says I need some delegate that takes the movie as the first argument and returns a true or a false, and they call it predicate. So we're going to match this sort of the same naming convention and style and stuff like that. We have to, since we want to create and this method single, it returns an enumerable of movie. So this thing is going to return an enumerable of t, since we want to make this generic, and we're going to call this method single else exception, and it's the generic method on t, and of course it takes the second argument will be what the first argument is. This will be func of t bool, and we'll call this predicate. And so far the signature looks exactly like the extension method, the single method, right? There's no difference here. I'm going to implement this method first as a single, and then we'll extend that to include the else exception part and such. So far there's nothing different here, even though these are higher order functions. If there's already a higher order function, because it's taking a func, right? So this is taking a delegate here as a method argument, and therefore this is a higher order function. In fact, a lot of LINQ methods are higher order functions. That's really where. But what if you were to make your own? Or how do you get there? That's the exercise point of this exercise. So as a simplistic implementation of single, okay, so we'll Now you can tell from by this implementation, probably some of you might have sort of figured out why the single method is doing what it does in the pre-existing implementation, and that is it boots out as soon as it finds more than one without trying to figure out how many. That's like an optimization, but unfortunately I think that optimization is causing more pain than good, and maybe we should have a choice. Maybe there should be an overload, and so that's what this extension method is going to do. We have the option to use single, we have the option to use single else exception, right? So that's that. So at some point here, after this for each, essentially you're going to say, well, if the matched elements has exactly one, then you're cool. If not, then there's a problem, right? So in other words, if it's not equal to one, then the count of matched elements is not equal to one, then you have a problem. It's either 0, as in none were matched, or more than one were matched. So I'm just going to write that logic. So if matched elements dot count is not equal to 1, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. All right. And else we can just return the 0th element here, right? So return matched elements of 0. So we know there's at least one there. All right. So not sure what it's complaining about here. Oh yeah, so this is not, oh, it's actually taking 9 over. Let me see, what does it do here? It returns a, oh, it returns a single movie. So sorry, this should be returning T, not a 9 over. Okay, so that matches the single method signature. Now here's where we want to start working on the extension part. So when this condition is true, we know we have a problem. What do we do? How do we meet our requirement? The requirements being, I want to be at the call site, I want to be able to control the type of exception I want it to throw. I want contextual information from the call site to be included in the exception message, and I want this method to tell me how many elements it found and which ones they are. So in other words, I would like to get the matched elements somehow, so I can see the count and I can also see the details. I can go into, like in this case, movies, and look at all the details of which movies exactly match. So I can, maybe it's a bad, I've got bad data in my database, or somebody sent me bad information, or whatever the case may be. So it'd be a lot more useful. So the way this is going to, maybe there's other ways to implement this, but the way I'm going to implement this is from the call site. So I'm going to now, instead of using single, I'm going to use single else exception. Right? Same signature, except so far it's the same signature. I want to add to this. What I'm going to add here, I want to pass in a delegate. So this becomes another higher order function, not because of the second method, but it's already a higher order function. From the call site, I want to say, hey, call me with the matched elements, right? So I can use that information. I already am in the call site, so I can already use contextual information. I know what I'm doing in that specific spot. And I can return to it an exception with the message so that it can throw it. Make sense? So the argument here will be a func that takes an enumerable of t, whatever the t is, in this case like movies. So whatever the matched movies are, you can take that. And the second argument will be an exception, that is the return type of this func. Remember, in the case of func of t's, the second or the last argument is the return type, and all previous arguments are the incoming arguments. And I'm going to call this the exception factory. Why is it called an exception factory? Because that method effectively is a factory. You give it some information, it's going to return to you an exception. So it decided what exception to throw, it decided what to put in the exception message, and this single else exception method will simply just throw it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to throw the exception factory's return value, and we're going to pass it the matched elements, and that satisfies the signature. So this part is, the correct implementation. Maybe over here you want to do some optimization or whatever. That's not the point of this episode here, but simply talking about this higher order function. So on the call side now, I have to provide it with something. I don't know why this is not zooming in correctly. Oh well, I'll have to zoom it in and post or something. Okay, for those of you who can see this, it says it needs a func, and the func is going to give you a collection of, in this case, movies, and the func has to return an instance of an exception. Okay, so let's just define a new exception. Let's call this expected movie not found exception. Expected exception. And okay, so there's my expected exception over here. So now let's look at this func. So I'm going to implement this as a lambda, and so I'm going to get movies. So I'm just going to call it movies for those of you who are not very comfortable with lambdas. I'm going to implement that here, right? So I'm going to get a bunch of movies, and I want to be able to throw. So I'm going to return new this exception of ours, and I'm going to put in some text here. Okay, so that's as simple as it gets. I'm going to get a collection of movies from the single else exception method. And so now in my lambda, I have access to the movies. And in my lambda, I'm going to I'm going to return a new instance, and the single else exception method will actually throw the exception. So I can construct any method, any message I want, using context information that is local to my call site, using in this case, the movies that I got back from the single else exception. So I can give just a count, I can extract their titles, I can do anything I want and construct a nice, useful exception message. And of course, I'm deciding also the type of exception I want to be throwing. And I return that exception to, the single else exception method, and it's just going to throw it. And our requirements been met. Let's just see it. I'm going to keep it simple. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to construct an exception message, but just for those who are curious, I can have something, found so many movies. I can include the criteria. So it's found so many movies for the year 2019. I'm hard coding it here, but you can imagine that 2015 is actually a local variable in this method, so I can actually just use it here. So this is 2015 for the year 2015, but we were expecting exactly one. So I don't know how many movies are going to match this, so let's see that. And here we throw this. So when we execute this, so let's say I were to do like a 2 array, that's when we are, yeah. No, this is a single. My mistake. Okay, so as we run this application, we should see the exception. And here we see the exception message. It says expected movie not found exception, found 7 for the year 2015, but we were expecting exactly 1. There you have it. I think this, and of course you can, as I said, you can expand this exception message, make it a lot more useful and meaningful, but I've used contextual information from the call site. So the year that I was filtering on, I've got that information. I got back information from the single else exception as to how many elements it found and which ones exactly they are. I've not used that in the exception message here. I could have extracted all the titles for the 7 movies and displayed those. So somebody who's trying to debug the system, especially in production, it becomes very difficult to debug issues in production when you have a message that says sequence contains more than one element. Like, how's that supposed to help? Anyway, so I hope this was a useful introduction to higher order functions. This is just one use of it. As I said, LINQ is full of them. Once you understand them, you can use them. I also use higher order functions for what I call poor man's polymorphism. I think I explained it in the other video. So please go take a look at that if you are not comfortable with delegates, and then come back and watch this again or re-watch this again. And until then, I will see you next time.